Hello, my name is Daniel Jedediah Cook, and the title of today's video is called Beyond the Archetype. So first off, I want to give you the definition of the word archetype, and then I want to tell you a story. See, the word archetype is seen as the original pattern or the model from which all things of the same kind are copied or on which they are based, a model or first form, if you will. So in looking at this original pattern is that pattern that we will copy, the pattern that we will become. And the reason I'm using the word archetype here is I want to use Yahweh and put him in the place of this archetype because he is our original pattern. He is from which all things of the same kind are copied. We are his sons, we are his kings, and we are his priests. And the original copy of that is what we want to become. All of us have the heart cry of Yahweh, and that is to be able to become what we behold, to look at him in his face and become who he is here on this earth. We want to make that heaven and earth connection, to be him here on this earth. But I've got a couple of questions that go along with that kind of need to be asked. And that is, how do I see that archetype? What is the way that I see it? Are there any paradigms? And paradigms are literally patterns of thought, if you will. So the original pattern, paradigms are a pattern of thought about how I see that archetype. And you and I both know that there's a couple of different ways that we can see and we can understand an archetype. You know, I remember as a child growing up how, I was told about Yeshua and how he died on the cross for me. And I was told all the stories that went along with the Bible stories. And they're good stories. And I'm not saying anything about that. But I was told about these things. But there came a point in my life where I began to see them for myself. And I began to understand them from a totally different perspective. And as a result, the paradigms that I had as a child growing up changed because I was seeing it no longer from the perspective of what somebody had told me, but from the perspective of what I knew for myself. Well, I want to tell you guys a little bit of a story because I want to tie this together in talking about the Hebrew letter Beyt. Because I've begun to see how understanding these concepts, this concept that Yahweh had talked to me about, really goes along with the Hebrew letter Beyt. Well, quite some time ago, Yahweh took me to a place, and there's a long story here that I would love to share, and one day I will share here very soon. But I want to cut into a little bit of that story right now. Because I remember waking up one Saturday morning and beginning to cry out, and something in my spirit, I could tell there was a word in my spirit that was beginning to build and beginning to just wanting to erupt out of me. And so I sat down with a cup of coffee and I began to pray and I began to meditate. And when I did, Yahweh took me into our secret place. And this time he took me to the very first time that he had taken me in there. In the very same place that I had been there the very first time that I had been there. And I stood up, and it was a beautiful, beautiful scene, a beautiful area, because I could see this beautiful meadow that was stretched out in front of me. Over to the left, there was a river, and there was all manners of trees and beautiful flowers that were all up around the outside of that river as it meandered down the whole part of that meandering valley. There was a valley at the very, very bottom, and at the very furthest distance that I could see from where I was standing, there was one single mountain that seemed to range throughout the entire backside of the scene of where I was looking at. And I remember standing here and beginning to just pray, call on Yahweh, and I knew he was there, but he wasn't there standing necessarily right beside me, not at that moment. But I knew he was there because this was always the place where him and I go. And at this time, I began to notice that the creation, the part of me that was the part that was looking at that I was looking out over, began to change. It began to do something. And I noticed that over in the distance, the trees and over the trees over by the river here, they suddenly began to rustle in silence. And I noticed that the trees themselves and the flowers and the plants that were over there by the river were beginning to lean in toward me. And I was kind of wondering about all this, but then I looked at the grass and this beautiful meadow that was before me. And the same thing was happening there. It was as if their glory side, their the part of who they were began to turn and look towards me. And again, I was amazed. I was amazed at what was happening. I even looked over to the mountains, and I saw the mountains leaning in, as if they were leaning in to listen to what I was about ready to say, because I knew that there was something about ready to erupt out of my spirit. Now, in the far distance, but yet right beside me at the same time, I could also see the face of Yahweh. And so he himself was actually stopping and listening and wanting to hear what was about ready to come out of my heart. And I was amazed at the fact that it seemed like, at least in our secret place, that all of creation was responding, and Yahweh himself was also responding in looking towards me when I was about ready to be able to let this erupt. As you can tell, it's kind of one of those things where it's awesome and amazing all at the same time. So if I stumble over my words, please forgive me here. But I remember allowing and not Yahweh nodding at me as if it was time to go ahead and release this word. And I began to release this word, and I began to declare, and I began to cry out. I began to pour out my heart and everything that Yahweh had placed in there that it needed to be released in that place. Now, I'm not really going to say exactly what was said, because this is something that was between Yahweh and I, but there was a lot of things that just came pouring out of me at this time. It was a very personal, very, very awesome time. And as I finished up, I fell almost immediately to my face, because as I finished up, I realized that I had poured out everything that was within me at that moment. But not only that, but I fell on my face because of just the awesome wonder of the fact that the creation had stopped and turned towards me as I was beginning to declare this word. The trees and the flowers that were over by the river began to lean, and the mountain even began to lean in and listen to what I was saying. And I remember just falling on my face and crying out, Yahweh, why? Even you stopped to listen to this word that was coming out of my heart. And I was totally amazed. I didn't know what to say, what to think, how to feel. You know, the one thing that kept resonating inside my mind was, who am I? Who am I that this kind of reaction would happen in this place of just Yahweh and I, but still, who am I that creation would respond to the fact that I was standing there at the top of the hill, knowing that I was about ready to declare the word of Yahweh in me and back to him. And I remember Yahweh reaching out and lifting me up, and he looked at me, and I said, Yahweh, why did all of creation do this? Why did even you? I'm so humbled in the sense that all of these things happened, and that you stopped to even look at me during this time. And he looked at me and he said, it's not only about what you were saying when you were giving your word. It was because a son has been revealed. And oh man, you talk about messing me up again. Because Yahweh was saying not only that I was one of his sons, and I knew that, but this was Yahweh Almighty in the place of the secret place calling me his son. And I was blown away. So for the next little bit of time, I began to just meditate on what all that he had just got done saying to me, and if you will, I was just out. I was just totally out in him because I was so overwhelmed by what he was saying. And the next moment I realized that he was standing now closer to me. He was standing near to where I was standing. And when he did, he reached out his hand to me and he invited me. He said, "Come here. I want you to come." And so I began to get closer to him, and he says, "I want to invite you to step inside of me. I want you to be able to see through my eyes." Now, remember, in the archetype of the way that I'd always seen that, I grew up and hearing, and as many of you have as well, I grew up hearing about, I want to see through Yahweh's eyes. I want to see through his heart and through the way that he sees things. And this was the first time that Yahweh had invited me into this place and to actually step inside of him to see through his eyes. And funny, looking at it from the old archetype, I thought I had already done that. I thought I had already been in this place, but this was something new. This was something beyond what I had ever seen before. And I began to meditate on it. I began to wonder, Yahweh, what does this mean about seeing through your eyes? Yes, I've cried out, and thank you, because you're allowing me to see the very thing that I've cried out for my entire life, and that is to be able to see through your eyes. But I began to recall where I was at all of this time as I began to meditate on this a little bit more. I was inside of the secret place, and he was inviting me to step inside of him. Well, one of the first things that when I had stepped into the secret place, this was a time before this particular time that I'm telling the story about. And the very first time that he took me into our secret place, I remember asking Yahweh this one thing. I said, "Yahweh, I never, ever, ever want to leave this place." And he looked back at me and he said, "Well, you don't have to. It's inside of you." And so from that moment on, I knew that I never, ever had to leave this secret place. I could stay in this secret place with him always. And I could carry it because it carried it with me. And I could always be inside of the secret place and yet being able to take care of work and other things that I had going on. And as I began to meditate on what had just happened, because he had invited me inside of himself to be able to see through his eyes, I began to think about that a little bit more, and it began to make a little bit of sense. I went to the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is basically the oral Torah. It's a body of Jewish civil and ceremonial law, but it was part of the oral Torah. It was a part of the Torah that was passed down, and the understanding of the laws and that sort of thing. And there is a scripture in the Talmud in a place called Sukkah 52, Sukkah, Sukkah 52. And it said this. It said, wow. He said this, and this was I'm breaking into a pattern of thought here that was being talked about in this area of Sukkah 52. And it basically was talking about the people during those time of the Messiah. And so Yahweh himself was speaking to the people with regards to this time of the Messiah. Now we know that as for us, we are already in that time of the Messiah. And what Yahweh himself said was, if it is wonderful in the eyes of the remnant of those people, the people who were in the time of the Messiah, if you will, or as I like to say, his sons, it will also be wonderful in my eyes. I'm going to repeat that one more time. If it is wonderful in the eyes of the remnant of those people, talking about his sons, it will also be wonderful in my eyes. And when he said that, I began to realize a little bit more in depth about what he was showing me here, because I began to realize that I was not only looking through his eyes in the very core of my spirit man, but that the two of us, through my spirit, through the place of the secret place, were looking through my eyes. of my body, of my soul, of the paradigms of the way that I think, and how I see the archetype, and how I see the pattern of who Yahweh is. And he was saying, if it's wonderful in your eyes, it's also going to be wonderful in my eyes. I hope you guys are understanding this, because the moment I began to realize this, I began to feel a responsibility that I had never felt before, in that I realized that it did matter about how I saw something. Because Yahweh was saying, if it's wonderful in your eyes, it's wonderful in my eyes. And as a result, I've just, oh man, again, messed up in the Holy Ghost. And I began to see how this began to also correlate with the Living Letter Beyt. See, Beyt is really, the way I like to describe the Living Letter Beyt is the first place of distinction. And, you know, if you look at a house, because Beyt is also represents that of the Living Letter Beyt. Beyt means house. And so you've got what's inside the house versus what's outside the house. And if you go to Genesis 1:1, the very first thing that Yahweh did was he separated the light from the darkness. And so Beyt was that first place of distinction. It became that place of the secret place. It became that place of home, if you will. It became that place of communion, that place of knowing him and understanding him and becoming who he is. But we were connected here to the earth as well. He placed us here in this earth for a purpose. And that purpose was so that we could look to the archetype, look to who he was, and become him in this earth. And that's what the Living Letter Beyt is talking about here. Because I began to see how I had a choice in the way that I saw things. I had a choice in forming the paradigms of what I saw in him. And there is no better archetype, no better way of being able to understand who Yahweh is, except in this place of communion, except in this place of the intimacy with just you and him. This place that I call, appropriately, the universe of two. Because it's the place of just him and I, or if you will, the place of Beyt. Beyt is also the number 2 in the Hebrew living letters as well. And so I began to understand a little bit more, and I began to understand I was responsible for the way that I saw things. And I was also responsible to hear from him, to listen to him, to have that communion with him, so that the paradigms that I formed were the paradigms that I could see through as I looked at the rest of the world and the things that I was seeing. And from that moment on, it completely changed the way I saw everything. And I still know there's more yet to come. But I'm going to go ahead and stop right there for this video and begin to explain a little bit more a little bit later on. But I hope this has been able to get across the heart of what Yahweh was showing me here. And I appreciate you listening in this time of me just pouring out from this very intimate place of me and Yahweh. Thank you, and you guys have a great